presents Your Voice Matters with Mr. Anselm Beach, the Senior Advisor to the Secretary of the Army for Diversity and Inclusion and the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army, Equity and Inclusion.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. It is good to see you. It is amazing to be here at AUSA 21. I looked around and I saw all kinds of fascinating new equipment. And it really goes to that whole theme that the Secretary and the Army's senior leadership talked about today, which is about modernization and people first. So you may be wondering, okay, so what is it I'm going to learn about modernization and people first, showing up at a session that talks about diversity, equity, inclusion? I want to tell you that I do believe that as we talk about technology and as we talk about people, I think those two have to be incremented equally so that we could really get the benefit of them all. We can't advance technology without preparing the people to fully utilize the technology. And we can't have advancements in modernization and technology without having the people to match the technology that we do have. So I do believe that it is the right time to really have a conversation around how we modernize in terms of equipment and how we modernize in people. One of the spaces that I believe is really ripe for modernization is the space of diversity, equity, inclusion. And the reason why is because, next slide please, is because diversity is a tough conversation. It's a tough conversation because in so many ways it's misunderstood. For the last year, my team and I have traveled all across the Army, and we have talked to over 8,500 soldiers and civilians about this very subject. And so I think we could say with some degree of accuracy that what you see on this slide really represents the plethora of thought about what diversity really is, right? And so the reason why it's right for modernization is because I believe as we move into the 21st century, as we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we need to be able to use the correct language and the appropriate parlance to better understand what are the end states that the Army is actually driving towards. So next slide, please. So these are going to be some of the voices that you've actually heard, that we have heard, and some of the themes that are represented in the last year and a half of just listening to voices. So those were some of the voices that we heard and some of the verbatim statements that were made over the last year while we went across 24 installations across the United States and overseas, listening to the voices of soldiers and civilians. And if you're an Army leader today, or if you've been connected with the Army and you saw something that upset you, you should. You should. And so that is part of the reason why the conversation becomes very difficult. And that's another reason why today, as we talk through what we have heard, we want to provide you some ways that we could help to mitigate some of the risks that we have heard during the last year. But as you see, I think that, we all who have ever worn the uniform of the United States Army, we love the Army. We love this United States Army, and there's a reason, and it's because of this. That because even of all this, everything that we have heard, and everything that we've kind of not felt very comfortable with, but we realize that at the end of the day, we become a family once we join the Army. And I think that is probably one of the best statements that you could walk away with. So next slide, please. So actually, how did we get here? How did we get to go across the country and across the world to listen to soldiers and civilians? And it's because in 2020, we launched Project Inclusion. And Project Inclusion was the Army's way of getting to some end states about diversity, equity, inclusion across the Army. So it was established by the Secretary of the Army, and then we went across to all these different installations, and as we listened, we developed some themes, and those themes were in line with the Army People Strategy, which was actually released at AUSA in 2018. So again, very, very powerful lived experiences and stories of our soldiers and civilians. If there's one thing that you could take away from this slide, it would be that blue in the blue box, because it really just kind of gives you a summation of what we've done for the last year. More than ever, as we go through this presentation today, I want you to think about something. When I started out, I said, that one of the things that we need to do in terms of modernization around diversity, equity, inclusion is to create new mental models around it. But one of the things we also absolutely must do is ensure that when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, we are not talking about it as something that's kind of like out there, something that's nice to do, something like, that we do for different demographics. If you're a leader today, you absolutely have to start thinking that diversity, equity, and inclusion, leading diverse teams, leading teams across virtual environments is a 21st century leadership competency. Next slide, please. So this is really a quick overview of the listening sessions. Just to kind of, if you were doing like a qualitative research or any kind of research, one of the things that academia would always say is that you must kind of talk about your methodology. So as you kind of look at this, what we have actually done is to show you where we have gone and how we actually broke this out. So we broke it down in series of 5s. And why is 5 a magic number? Because after every 5, we stopped and then took all the themes that we've gathered, did some analysis when we went, and that helped to shape our approach for the next 5. So you would see that this has been a very iterative process, and so we keep, the more we know, the better we become, and that really is the process of a continuous improvement that we have matured as we continue these listening sessions. Next slide, please. So, I would tell you that when we started these listening sessions, one of the things that we think that we've been hearing a lot about, because it was right in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, we thought that we would hear a lot about race issues, discrimination issues. We thought that that would be the big thing that we would hear. The thing that we heard very loud and clear, and as we develop these themes, is number 1, that leadership does matter. So as we talk about leading, as we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and as we think about all these different things that, sounds cool, that sounds trendy, we've got to get back to the very basics, and leadership does in fact matter. So how you set the environment to have inclusive teams is a leadership responsibility. Let's be very clear. In the United States Army, diversity, equity, and inclusion, 3 words, is really the foundation to how we build cohesive teams in an inclusive environment. So as you think about that, when we heard about these, and I just provided you with the top 5 themes that we've gathered, the first one is leadership. What does that mean? Soldiers, the feedback that we've gotten is that leadership is either lazy or leadership is toxic. There were concerns about height, weight, etc., body standards, compositions, and this really had to do with biological differences across different races of people, right? So that was one thing. Take a look at number 3, and I would get back to that. But as we go down, and it talked about having mentorship programs, it talked a little bit about the disconnect between people first, what that means, because it means something's very different at the top of the Army and something very different at where the rubber meets the road in the operational force. But just look at number 3, for example. The Army loses capable and competent soldiers, civilians, and leaders due to the lack of recognition, lack of diversity, and lack of talent management. As you think about how the Secretary posited her remarks today, and she talked about discrimination, and she talked about talent management, if you are to cluster those things, what we are actually saying is that this is a real threat to national security. I know, some people might sit there and they say, well, how did you get there? We get there as we go. If we don't have the right people in the right places to fight and win, it's a threat. But you think about that for a minute. The Army loses capable and competent soldiers. And as we think about the Secretary saying the hard decisions that we have to make, we can't afford to lose talent. We cannot afford to lose talent. As you think about it, in the competitive in the competitive space, where we compete for talent with both the private sector and other federal agencies, we are the United States Army. We can't afford to lose anything. So we've got to be able to dominate and win in that space, in the talent space as well. Next slide, please. So one of the interesting things that we have found out is that diversity, equity, and inclusion, sometimes abbreviated as DEI, tends to be conflated into kind of one word. Most people say, most times, that when they say this organization lacks diversity, it's very much in a binary way. It's a one-dimensional way, and it becomes all about representation. Don't get me wrong, representation is important to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but if you start and you stop in the same place, that could never be progress. So diversity, equity, and inclusion is not about a number. It is not about a number. It's about how we create cohesive teams in an inclusive environment to fight and win. So you're already familiar with these terms. These terms, that's how the Army defines it. But there's one thing that I want to draw your attention to, and this is the thing that seems to have like the most attention every time we go someplace, is the notion of equity. The notion of equity. And a lot of people would say, why does it have to be equity? Why is it not equality? I'm glad you asked. We are very much familiar with this notion of equality, right? It shows up twice. It shows up in the 14th Amendment. It also shows up in the Bill of Rights. So we kind of get stuck into this notion of equality. And don't get me wrong, equality is a great word. Nothing against it. However, I think there's a lot of times we get locked into a kind of a rules-based mentality as opposed to a principle-based mentality. Every law has a correlating principle. There's an end state that law is trying to drive towards. So for us, when we think about equality, there's this interpretation that equality means everybody gets the same thing. Just think about that for a minute. If everybody got the same thing, it means the infantry get the same thing as the field artillery. Wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. So the notion of equity is more of a principle to drive an end state as it is, as opposed to the strict interpretation of equality that everybody gets the same thing. So that is one of the things that we always tend to run into as we get out on the road and we talk about these different terms. So next slide, please. Last thing I would say about equality versus equity is that think about in the civilian workforce about people who are visually impaired. If everybody got the same computer, right, that's just equality, the visual person with a visual impairment, they need some extra software to make it work. It's not that they're getting something that they don't deserve. It's not that they're getting something extra. They're being provided with additional tools to provide an outcome for the Army. So we give people equipment not because we believe it's a nice thing to do, to give them something that they don't deserve, but everything we do in the United States Army is driven towards an outcome, which is to be able to fight and win. So because we know that diversity, equity, and inclusion has been such a difficult conversation for various reasons, political landscape, everything else, because people think that you need special language to be able to talk about it, what we have done is come up with this model. And so what we are positing is that diversity, equity, and inclusion is already foundational to the Army and leadership language. It's already familiar, it's already ingrained in the principles of the Army ethic. As you look at the Army ethic, you see a lot of times trust is repeated. You look at the Army leadership model, be no do, something I learned many moons ago when I was a non-commissioned officer. It is the foundation. This language is very organic to the Army. So leaders are already familiar with this, and so what we have done now is really to integrate the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion into the foundational language of doctrine that the Army uses. So why have we done that? Because we wanted to take away any kind of trepidation about talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so to provide leaders a more organic way to engage around diversity, equity, and inclusion, we came up with a framework of 3 questions to distill a very complex theoretical aspect of people. And so we call it the WHO model. We think that every leader needs to know the answer to 3 questions. The first one that leaders need to know is who a people are. Who are your people? It goes beyond that kind of superficial, this is Jason Barton, he is married, he is from Texas, he's a sergeant major. Beyond that, what is it about Jason Barton? What drives him? What are his passions? What are those causes that he is extremely focused on once he takes the uniform off? The second question is, how do people show up? How do people show up? Meaning, how do they approach work? Are they introverted? Are they extroverted? What are those dimensions that they bring into the workplace that helps them to drive production or performance? The third question really is, what do they have to offer? What do they have to offer? There are many times when we think about people, and we think about them based on their rank, or we think about them based on their position description or their GS grade. But people are so much more than that. And so as you think about these 3 questions, what we are really talking about is deep engagement. We're talking about deep engagement. And which leader do not want to know who their people are, how their people show up, and what they have to offer? What this also does is, in parallel, it moves beyond the notion of representation only as we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion to talk more about the value that diversity brings, the ability to drive innovation, the ability to provide different views on complex problems. That is what we have currently. Could you imagine, we've been in the COVID environment now for 18 months. Could you imagine if we didn't have Zoom, if we didn't have MS Teams, if we didn't have iPhones, if we didn't have video chat? Could you imagine a world without that? But in the same way we couldn't imagine a world without that, could you imagine, just go back, and everybody remember a company called Kodak? Now you remember it because it used to be a dominant company one time. And here's the deal. So Kodak, dominant company. But what did Kodak do? They made film. They made film. And one day this brilliant young engineer shows up and he goes, you know, I've got this great idea. I think we should start making digital cameras. Of course, that went over like a lead balloon, right? Just like, what? We are Kodak. We make film. So guess what? Another company heard about this bright engineer who had this idea to make digital cameras. What happened to Kodak? Went out of business. I'm simply saying to you is that if we believe that we could go into the 21st century with outdated notions about leadership and about leading diverse teams and managing diversity, we are going to be like Kodak. We are going to be like Kodak. However, there's good news, because now there's a model in which any leader could really get to some of these complex notions of diversity, equity, inclusion without thinking that you had to go to some class or become an overnight expert. Here's the thing about this. The same three questions that as a leader you want to know the answers to, the lead also needs to know the answers to those questions about you. So what this does is actually forces us as leaders to be able to model the behaviors that we want into the workplace. It forces us to be able to then be authentic, make our audio match our video. This is where we are right now. And we are now working with the great folks out at Combined Arms Center to make sure that this is now included in the new Army manual on leaders, on developing leaders. Next slide. So, for those of you who may be asking, okay, that's good, sounds great, why do I need to do it anyway? So, I want you to focus on this area. Focus on that area. Self-actualization. And you probably remember this from your social science class back in college, the Maslow hierarchy of needs. And I want you to think for a minute, what is it that we ask soldiers and civilians to do in the United States Army? We ask them to self-actualize. We ask them to be part of something way bigger than themselves. We ask them to be their best. We ask them at times to give up their lives for this nation. That is self-actualization. Here's the problem. The problem is that we ask soldiers and civilians to self-actualize, but we never want to make sure that we provide for their psychological needs, for their safety needs, and for their love and belonging needs. That is where that is the crux of being a cohesive and inclusive team. When you have inclusion in your workplace, it's not something nice to do. It's not something that you do simply because it's the right thing to do. It is something that you do because that is the way that is one of the domains that we need to fight and win in. That is absolutely one of the ways that we need to be able to compete for talent. It's absolutely one of the ways that we are going to be able to optimize talent in the 21st century. Next slide, please. So let me thank you first for showing up this afternoon. Let me thank you for being a part of this Warriors Corner. It's kind of not intuitive to come to AUSA and come to a Warriors Corner to hear about a year of listening and talk about the kind of squishy diversity, equity, inclusion stuff. But I would tell you what, I hope that you would leave here this afternoon with some new mental models around diversity, equity, inclusion. I hope that you're going to leave here this afternoon thinking that as a leader in the 21st century, there's some things that I need to be able to change in how I lead. I hope that you could leave here this afternoon with the ability to apply those 3 questions and to be able to realize change or gaps within your formations and to be able to navigate a very complex issue in a very simple kind of framework manner. So thanks again very much for your time. And at this time, I will get some questions.
Hello, thank you for your presentation, very informative. So the last comment you made with self-actualization, you stated that the Army fails to do the bottom. So can you expound upon that a little bit?
Sure. So, so to explain on the bottom, and if you could just go back 1 slide. So talks about, love and belonging, safety needs, psychological needs. And I think this is, as we went across listening to, across the Army, just listening, there's some things that would show up like barracks issues or dining facility issues, this need psychological safety in the barracks issues. And I think we see some of the manifestations in some of the latest sharp reports, et cetera, the suicide rates, et cetera. And so those are the things that we talked about at the bottom. And so ultimately, what I would say is, as a leader, the goal is to focus really on the basics. If you were to think about this, as you start focusing on the basics around psychological safety, around safety in the barracks, about dining facility issues, pay issues, housing issues, those cluster of things, I think they are where the Maslow base would fall along. And as we focus to those things, I think we help to get to that whole notion of self-actualization and trust within the formations. Thank you very much. Thought we were going to slide out from here.
No. I'll ask a quick question. So it's really cool that you went out and you listened to 8,300 people, 169 different meetings, 24 different installations. Is there an idea to expand that across the Army enterprise? Because we all know that trust starts, or listening starts with trust starts with listening. So I'm sure those people feel different having participated in those programs and being felt that they were listened to. Is there a way that we can expand that across the enterprise?
Absolutely. So the goal, there was a slide up there that showed the different tranches. So we are not finished yet. We're still in the first phase of this. But I would tell you what's even more exciting about this is that not just did we go out and listen, but we developed 20 themes, came back, developed an Army enterprise-wide approach to mitigate the gaps identified in those 20 themes. I could tell you that right now, the Army is experimenting with BAS. So there are places where they're piloting BAS now, where there's going to be a card where soldiers could go to any food installation because sometimes they miss meals, etc. That was one of the things. The postpartum, 365 days after postpartum, uniform. So those are things, those are actions that we have taken across the Army. And some of those are driven in part because of the listening that we've had. So we're actually making this a 360 degree feedback mechanism loop. We will go out again, to say, hey, back in 2019 or 20, we were here, and these were the things that we've heard. These are the things that your leadership done. These are the things that happened at headquarters of the Department of the Army. Where are you now? So it is very much going to be an iterative process and continue to feedback and feed that information across so that the force understands that their voice matters. Their voice matters, and when they voice their concerns, the Army listens and we take action.
Thank you, sir, for your wonderful presentation. In your opinion, what would be the challenges for to put the 3 questions in reality, in practice, to reach the goal of the equity, inclusion, and the
So-
three things.
Yes, so thank you very much. And I would tell you that we actually chose those three questions because they're questions that are organic to Army doctrine of small group leadership, right? So every leader, they're familiar with this, but we also know that with diversity, equity, inclusion, it also requires us to think a little bit differently, and sometimes that could feel kind of foreign. So we wanted to provide language that leaders are already familiar with, and it really gets to the whole end states. So what I see as some of the challenges, it really is our ability right now to socialize or normalize that and scale it. I think rounds are complete.